Hello and welcome. With us today is a man who stood side by side the great Nelson Mandela as they both saw their great nation, South Africa, make a transition through the gruesome apartheid regime to what it is today, the Rainbow Nation. A man who's paid a desperate price for standing for what he believed in. Very honored to have Father Michael Lapsley with us today. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Chevaan, and great to be with you and to be with the viewers and listeners. Thank you. Here in Sri Lanka.
Father, let me start at the very beginning. You're a New Zealander. What were you doing in South Africa?
Thank you very much. I was born and brought up in New Zealand. At the age of 17, I left New Zealand to go to Australia to begin to train to be a priest of the Anglican Church and to join an Anglican religious order, the Society of the Sacred Mission. I was ordained as a priest in 1973, and my congregation, my religious order, decided to transfer me to South Africa. I often say that the day I arrived in South Africa, I stopped being a human being and became a white man.
Alan Michael Lapsley was born in New Zealand on the 2nd of June 1949. He was sent to South Africa in 1973, straight after his ordination, to continue his studies and to act as chaplain to the students on several university campuses. He was 24. It was here that he joined the growing struggle against apartheid. This political regime rejected all civic, economic, and social equality between black and white people. During this struggle, he became a victim of an assassination attempt in 1990, which led to the loss of both his hands and the vision in his right eye. In 2011, he told his journey towards inner healing in the book Redeeming the Past, My Journey from Freedom Fighter to Healer.
Every single aspect of my life was decided by the color of my skin. I went to live in a white suburb by law. I was already a priest, but I was going to South Africa to study. So I went to study at a university for white people. I walked through the park, and there are seats to sit on. They're all marked whites only. I went to sort out my student visa, and there were 2 elevators, 2 lifts. One says whites only, and the other doesn't say blacks, it says goods or parcels and non-whites. I guess when I really felt they'd lost it is when I went to the beach and found that the sea was divided according to race. I sometimes thought, are they worried that if we swim together, the color will come off in the water? So in a way, I had to ask myself, is the society mad or bad, or a combination of both? So in a way, for me, the decision to join the liberation struggle was about wishing to recover my own humanity in solidarity with black people struggling for their own basic human rights.
We're going to come to that, the liberation struggle. But what was the conviction? Was it family? Was it your upbringing? Was it a moment in your life as a child that attracted you to the clergy, that brought you into a journey that eventually made you an Anglican priest? Let's start there.
Well, I was brought up by devout Christian parents. I was very much a child of the church. from the very beginning. But also in my home and in the church, I saw my parents treating people with equal dignity. I saw people of different colors and races. I always remember as a child in the church that sometimes bishops from Africa would visit us, and people were excited and treated them with dignity and respect. And my father was a big friend of the Maori bishop. So I'm not saying that there was no racism in New Zealand. There was. But I had this vision of a human family from very beginning. But for me, it was about discipleship. It was about saying, I want to follow Christ. I want to follow Jesus. And so that led me to the monastery, it led me to the priesthood. So in a way, my choice wasn't for South Africa, it was for Christian discipleship. But then the community I belonged to, in which I made a vow of obedience, they chose to send me to South Africa. But however, as a child, I had read a book by a man called Trevor Huddleston, who was a priest in South Africa, and he told the story of forced removals under apartheid. And in a way, he was the person who blew the whistle in the English-speaking world as to what was happening in South Africa. So I knew that in South Africa there was something that was contrary to the Christian gospel. So the issue of, as a person of faith, being against racism came very early. But there was another thing that happened when I was about, I suppose I was 10 years old. There was a petition in our local church because the Springboks, the South African rugby team, had invited the All Blacks to come to South Africa on one condition: they leave the Maori players behind, who of course were the best rugby players. So this petition in our local church was no Maoris, no tour. So that petition in the church brought together the issues of race and racism, justice and faith, and also South Africa and sport were all encapsulated in that incident. But I mean, I never imagined either reading that book or that experience that one day my own life was going to become intertwined with the life and journey of the people of South Africa.
Michael Lapsley joined the Anglican religious community in Australia in 1967. In 1971, he took his vows in the Society of the Sacred Mission. Lapsley was ordained as a priest in 1973. In that same year, the community chose to transfer him to South Africa to enroll in undergraduate studies in the city of Durban. It was in South Africa that Father Michael Lapsley's life would be changed forever.
Whatever prepared you for South Africa, your Christian faith and your training, nothing could have prepared you for what you encountered when you finally landed in Johannesburg or in Cape Town.
Cape Town, in Durban, in fact.
In Durban, okay.
I suppose, you know, in my naivety, you see, I had read a lot about South Africa, so I had a lot of head knowledge, but if you like, I didn't have heart knowledge or experiential knowledge. So I felt that when I arrived in South Africa, I was going to find three groups of people: the oppressed, and the oppressor, and the human race that I would belong to.
Right.
And the first rude awakening was that my whiteness meant that I was part of the oppressive group. I could choose to be against apartheid, but I was choosing from the side of those who were its beneficiaries.
When we refer to apartheid, we immediately connect it with Nelson Mandela and his fight against it for half a century, and eventual emancipation of the people of South Africa. But what was the apartheid that you saw in the 70s when you arrived in South Africa, lived in South Africa? What did it really mean? We know that it means apartness, separation, segregation, but tell me in your words.
Well, in a sense, the great myth of apartheid was separate but equal. But of course it was separate but extremely unequal. And what I was describing at the beginning of the interview was what we called, if you like, petty apartheid. But however, the visually dramatic signs of apartheid. But there was also middle apartheid, which was the division of the suburbs but even more, according to racial classification, but even more was the division of the land, that we who were white, who were made up, to use today's figures, about 5 million out of 55 million, owned 87% of the land. And also, as a white person, within a few years, I could get the vote. But the majority had no vote. The majority were voteless, which also meant they didn't have, if you like, non-violent legal ways of ending that system, because they were denied the vote. So in a sense, the vote was seen as something fundamental, you know, one person, one vote. But it's important that we see that the history of apartheid goes back through the centuries. And even the history of the African National Congress of South Africa begins in 1912. And it's also interesting that the first 3 presidents of the liberation movement were ministers of religion who had heard a gospel of freedom and equality, but experienced racism and oppression. And for me as a Christian, one of the terrible realities of apartheid was it was carried out in the name of Christianity, that the apartheid regime claimed divine guidance for what they did. So this was the very opposite of the faith that I had learned in childhood in the church.
Well, racism carried out in the name of religion has not, unfortunately, left us.
Exactly. So it is, but somehow in South Africa we had the worst form of the disease because it was constitutionalized racism. But in a way, of course, apartheid was a political issue, an economic issue, and a justice issue, but it's also a faith issue, because back in the 19th century, even, there were white Christians who would not sit with black Christians at the table of the Lord. And so in a way, the church itself was a site of struggle, a context of struggle, where there were those who bought in to the lie of apartheid, that the most important thing about us is the color of our skin, and those who, if you like, saw it was bad but did nothing, and then those who saw that their faith required for them to act for justice. So of course the struggle itself was an interfaith struggle. There were people of all religions involved, but it was of particular importance for Christians because it was in the name of our faith that this evil system was carried out, which is why it was important as well to mobilize the faith community internationally. And I think as South Africans, in a way, we were very fortunate because in some ways, particularly by the middle of the 1980s, our struggle had become the cause of all humanity. So you could go to any country in the world and you would find formations and people. If you talk to political leaders who are now 60, 70, 80 years old, and you say, when did you become first involved in politics as an issue of justice? They'll tell you, apartheid was that issue.
What was the turning point? You were a chaplain, you were a priest, a foreigner in South Africa. What was the turning point? What made you identify with the ANC cause, in a sense?
Well, when I went to South Africa, I was a pacifist, which is unusual for Anglicans. We bless most wars in history. But I had read my Mahatma Gandhi, my Martin Luther King, my Jesus of Nazareth, and I was convinced that you could get justice in any and every situation by non-violent means. I believed in it as a tactic and as a principle. I mean, I even thought that perhaps my father had been wrong as a Christian to be part of the war against Hitler. So then I come to South Africa, and firstly I begin to see that violence was not simply when black people picked up weapons, but it was a violent system, and that laws themselves were violent. And also I came to see the power of language, not just to reveal, but to mystify. So, for example, when the apartheid state used violence against an unarmed people, it was called the defense of law and order. When people eventually picked up weapons, they said this is violence and terrorism. But the turning point for me and for my generation was in 1976. Because in 1976, black school children began to protest against having to use Afrikaans as a language for their lessons, which was not their first language.
But they were being taught in English.
They've been taught in English or in African languages. And now they were being forced to learn Afrikaans. Now many black people do speak Afrikaans, but it's also seen for many South Africans, black people, as a language of oppression. They were also protesting that the education system was especially designed to keep black people in inferior positions. And also for every $1 spent on a black child, $10 was spent on a white child.
On the 16th of June 1976, 20,000 students met in Soweto, a suburb of Johannesburg, for a large peaceful demonstration and to say no to speaking the Afrikaans language of the white people. But in the face of the huge number of people marching, the police very rapidly began to fire into the crowd. 575 people died, among whom were many children. The fatal violence of that Wednesday, the 16th of June, would spread throughout the whole country. Soweto became the epicenter of racial movement that would never be extinguished.
Welcome back. We have Father Michael Lapsley with us, speaking to us about his experiences in South Africa during a time the country was liberating itself from apartheid. Father Lapsley, we spoke of your entry into South Africa and your eventual exile to Zimbabwe. What are the circumstances that led you to be exiled to Zimbabwe? You must have done something very bad.
Well, they never provided a reason. And in fact, I was first exiled to the small mountain kingdom of Lesotho. And then after a massacre there, I went to Zimbabwe. I had begun to see that apartheid was a choice or an option for death carried out in the name of the gospel of life. Now, my conclusion is, because before I joined the liberation movement and afterwards, I wasn't a gun runner. I didn't use any automatic weapon, except the one I'm using now, my tongue. So my conclusion was that it was my theology that was a threat to the apartheid state, because part of my work was this unmasking, delegitimizing the claim of the apartheid state to be Christian.
Did you have any sort of apprehension or rejection from the institute you represented for your individual actions?
The church, you mean?
The church.
Well, the church itself was this context of struggle. Today, some of the theologians say there were three kinds of theology in the South African churches. One was state theology that brought together almost seeing the state as divine, and that we all owe obedience to the state, and what the state does is God's will, which was particularly embodied in the Dutch Reformed Church. But then there was what was called church theology, and this church theology were people who said, we believe in reconciliation, we believe in healing, but in the end didn't do very much, and almost equated the violence of the apartheid state with the violence of oppressed people seeking their freedom. And then there was a prophetic theology which linked faith and justice and also faith and action. So that part was very supportive to me. But I also received a lot of animosity from church people as well. Because in some ways, some of them, I think, felt judged by the things I was choosing to do that challenged what they were were not doing. So indeed, the church itself was this context of struggle.
So in Zimbabwe, you continue your fight. The ANC is now, well, it has a militant wing, as it were. You're breaking all sorts of rules. Mr. Mandela is by now in prison. What was your relationship with him? What was he like?
Well, by the time I arrived in South Africa, Nelson Mandela was in prison. He'd been in prison for many years. And it was illegal to read anything he'd said. All his books, his speeches were banned. You couldn't even see, images of him. And the white regime was saying, he's this terrifying terrorist leader, so dangerous that you can't even read the words he said. And in fact, about 2 years after I came to South Africa in about 1975, I went back to New Zealand to visit my family. And I thought, I need to know more about Nelson Mandela. So I went to my local public library in the small town of Hastings in New Zealand. And I discovered this book, No Easy Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. And I read it. And I was thinking, I'm going to read this extremist, And the book profoundly shocked me, because here was a book about a man with a moral vision of how we could live together in peace with justice for all South Africans, a vision of a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic country. And then I realized why we were not allowed to read what he said, not because of his extremism, but because of his reasonableness and because of his vision and commitment to a common humanity.
The ANC, the African National Congress, had been fighting for the promotion of civil rights for black people since 1912, but in 1961 confronted with a failure with a strategy that had been non-violent. So far, Nelson Mandela created a military branch which led the movement into armed resistance. Arrested and imprisoned for life on Robben Island, Nelson Mandela became the international symbol of the struggle against apartheid.
I think there are many extraordinary things about Nelson Mandela. One of them is that he was always self-deprecating and encouraged people not in the sense to take him too seriously, and also there was a lot of humor in him. As an account of the first time he visited Cuba, and he's traveling through the streets of Havana with Fidel Castro, and Nelson Mandela says, "It's wonderful the way all the people are waving to you, Fidel." And they said, no, it's for you, Nelson Mandela, actually. So he would always, and also, for me, one of the extraordinary things about Nelson Mandela was the way he could sometimes say to us as a nation, he was wrong. How many leaders are able to say that? He said, on some issues, my family has spoken to me and they said I'm mistaken. They have persuaded me. So there was that kind of, greatness as well. But also, I think it was the way he treated people. He treated people who had been his captors. On the day that he became the president, you had all the national leaders there. There was one person who none of us knew who he was. He wasn't the Chief Justice, he wasn't a general, he wasn't a political leader. And in fact, it was his prison guard. And in a way, he was saying to us as a nation, enemies can become friends. So he was also pointing towards the journey of healing and reconciliation that we as a country would need to travel over a very long period.
You spent 27 years in prison. You were in exile in Zimbabwe. And the anti-apartheid cause must have looked hopeless at some point. What was it that sustained you?
I think there was an article I also once wrote for the Council of Churches in which I said, the struggle is also my life. I think many of us began to see that this was to be an intergenerational struggle. The ANC itself had already lasted for generations. And there were people who lived and died, especially black people, and especially black women, who who never ever saw things get better. They only ever saw things get worse in their lifetime. But they had deep within them this belief that one day, there will be freedom, there will be justice, there will be peace for all. And so it was these moral giants, both of our leaders, but ordinary women and men and people of color and their sacrifices. And also, of course, there were also a minority of white people who were part of the struggle. So that was, I feel like, that inspired us. We had a sense that we traveled on the shoulders of giants as well. But of course, the time came when the Zimbabwean authorities came to me and they said, we have information that you're on a South African government hit list. And so from today, you'll live with armed police guards 24 hours a day. So for several years, I lived in that context of knowing that I was on a hit list. And so I had to ask myself, what is it that I'm living for if they indeed may kill me for it? So if you like, it was a struggle for which I was prepared to die. And I, as a chaplain in the liberation movement, I'd gone to the graveyard so many times, accompanying others on that final journey. But death I was prepared for. What I had not prepared for was permanent, major physical disability.
It was on the 28th of April 1990, at his home in Zimbabwe, while opening a package containing 2 religious magazines, a bomb exploded in his hands. Father Michael lost both his hands and the vision in his right eye, and his eardrums were shattered.
The act of opening the magazine was the detonating device for a bomb. I can still remember what happened, the actual explosion. It's still something with me. I remember pain of a scale that I didn't think a human being could ever experience. I remember going into darkness, being thrown backwards by the force of the bomb. The exact angle saved my life that I opened it. I opened it on a small coffee table. If I'd opened it in something like this, a table like this, it would have killed me because it would have knocked out the heart or knocked off the head.
Well, it was, February 1990, finally the Apartheid regime said they'll talk. The strength of the people of South Africa, the solidarity around the world had become so great. The Apartheid regime said, we'll talk. The ANC had first demanded that in 1912. So Nelson Mandela is released from prison. My armed guards are taken away because the regime said it's the age of negotiations, the war is over. I had just returned from visiting Canada. I was about to move from Harare to Bulawayo, the second city of Zimbabwe. But there was an accumulation of post, of mail, while I was away. And when I came back, step by step, I began to open the correspondence. And firstly, there was a letter from someone in South Africa saying, we're sending you some religious magazines. And then I came to this manila envelope, inside of which were 2 religious magazines. I opened the magazine and they exploded. And of course, that's how I lost my hands and eardrums were shattered. In that instant, I firstly had a sense that God was with me. God hadn't stepped in and said, it's a bomb, don't open it. I opened it, the bomb went off. So in the midst of my pain, experience of God with me, but also in that instant, I knew that the Apartheid regime had got me. I also knew that they had lost and I had won, because it was a bomb that was supposed to kill me and I was alive. So obviously that was the beginning of a new journey. Sometimes journalists say to me, oh, Father, you received the letter bomb. Did it affect you? I say, well, actually, surprise, surprise, yes. Obviously anything which is life-threatening will be life-changing. It will either cause us to diminish or to grow. But for the 14 years before the bomb had gone off, I'd lived, as I said, in Lesotho, Zimbabwe, but travelled the world as part of the struggle against apartheid. So when I was bombed, I received messages of prayer, love, support from people of faith, people of goodwill across the world, from Christians, from Muslims, from Jews, from Hindus, from Buddhists, from communists, from atheists. And that provided the context in which I was able to see that if I was filled with hatred and bitterness and self-pity and desire for revenge, that they would have failed to kill the body, but they would have killed the soul. So I began to travel this new journey from being a victim, which I obviously was, to being a survivor. I was alive, but towards victory, not in a militaristic sense, but in the sense of taking back agency, taking back the ability to shape and create the world. Mandela said to us, he said, he realized that when he left prison, if he did not leave hatred and bitterness at the prison door, he would be in prison forever. So in a sense, similarly for me, I was able to make that realization.
We're going to talk to you about how life changed after that fateful day, and as you said, how you began to shape your world, the world around you, as a result of that experience. We'll be right back after this break.
Father Michael's convalescence in Australia, then in Zimbabwe, lasted for over a year. However, in 1990, the dawn of a new era seemed to be breaking in South Africa, with peace talks underway between Nelson Mandela and Frederick de Klerk, who became president of South Africa in 1989. Convinced that he had a role to play in the healing of the nation, Father Michael chose to return to the land that he hadn't seen since 1976, even though it seemed like a crazy decision. In trying to re-establish his personal contact, he met Desmond Tutu, the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town in the south of the country. Archbishop Tutu gave him his support and allowed him to exercise his ministry in the diocese, and in 1993 to become the chaplain at the Trauma Center for Survivors of Violence and Torture.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
A letter bomb took out his hands, one eye, shattered his eardrums, and left him at death's door. And yet he made it, he survived, and he's right here with us. Father Lapsley, you spent months in hospital recuperating, and the realization that life was going to change dramatically from that point on must have certainly got you somewhere deep within. How did you deal with it?
You know, a little bit of the time, I thought it'd be better to be dead. Because I had no role models. I never met, I actually knew another priest who had also had a parcel bomb. He lost one hand, but he did everything with the other hand. So somehow losing two hands was not twice as bad, it was 200 times as bad.
Sure.
But it was this context of being prayed, loved for, supported. If you like, my story was acknowledged, reverenced, recognized by people around the world. And it was given a moral content. People said, what happened to me was wrong. So I began step by step to discover a new calling. Interestingly, there was a friend who called me in my hospital bed in Australia, and he said he'd been in exile and he'd just come back to South Africa, and he said, I was in Cape Town and they were talking about setting up a trauma center for victims of violence and torture. I think you could work there, you could assist there. Now everybody out of kindness was now telling me what I cannot do. You know, you've got no hands, you won't be able to get on planes, travel anywhere, you have to accept the reality. And here was somebody saying, you have a new qualification, your CV's better because of what's happened to you. So I began to realize that as I had been accompanied on my journey of healing, so the new calling was to accompany others. And you know, when I got back to South Africa, I've been away for 16 years, and I discovered a damaged nation, a nation damaged in our humanity, damaged by what we'd done, by what had been done to us, and by what we failed to do. And all of us with a story to tell. But unlike me, for millions of South Africans, their stories had not been acknowledged and reverenced and recognized. And people hadn't told them what happened to them was wrong. So often, all they had was their victimhood. So I realized that as for me, the medical treatment, the doctors, the nurses, the physiotherapists, occupational therapists, they'd all played a part. But the psychological, emotional and spiritual stuff had been happened by this process of accompaniment. So also I became chaplain of that trauma center and was there for 5 years. And while I was there, I realized that it was true that everybody had a story to tell. It was true that everybody had stuff in them. But it was not true that everybody needed clinical intervention. It was not true that everybody was pathological. Most of us got up in the morning, had our breakfast, went to work, had relationships, lived our lives. But we still had unfinished business from the past. We were still carrying pain and hurt and bitterness and anger,
baggage,
hatred, baggage, exactly. And I also realized that we wouldn't create a very nice country. We could build the houses and provide the water and the electricity and the education and the healthcare, but if we didn't deal with what we had in us, the baggage, we would not create a very nice nation. And so that led us to begin to conceptualize a process that we called the healing of the memories. Safe and sacred spaces where people could deal with the psychological, emotional and spiritual effects of our past. You know, when we think of the nation, we say politics, sociology, economics. We think of ourselves as individuals, psychologically, sexually, emotionally, spiritually. But we don't always look at how is the national story, the national history affected us. How has what happened to our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, how has that shaped us? What is it we have inside of us? Both beautiful stuff, which is life-giving, but also horrible stuff, baggage, which is indeed poisonous, which carries across from generation to generation.
What about your baggage? Have you healed your memories? Have you forgiven the person who did this to you?
Well, have I healed my... I think probably if I'd completely healed, I'm in heaven. I mean, I would have... So I think healing in a sense is a lifelong journey because new things keep happening. But in terms of, I have no regrets about the big choices that I made. And I would say that I lost a lot in that bomb. I lost hands that I will always grieve for. Losing your hands is like losing a loved one. Part of you will always grieve. I still have a lot. And I've gained. I know I'm a better human being for the journey that I've traveled. Now, forgiveness is a different question. As we sit here today in Colombo, it's what, 2019. The bomb happened in 1990. No one has come forward. No one has said...
So you don't know who did it?
I did it. No one has said, I'm sorry. You know, when I went to our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I said, I need to know 3 things. Who sent the bomb? Why did they send it? And the chain of command. How high in the land did it go? I don't know the answer to any of those questions. So for me, a healing of memories is always on the table. Sometimes forgiveness is on the table. But in my mind, I imagine an encounter with the person who sent me the bomb. And the encounter, and of course reality is not the same as the imagination. But let's suppose I go back to South Africa as I do on Wednesday. Someone knocks on my door in Cape Town and says, I sent you the bomb. Will you forgive me? Well, now forgiveness is on the table. What do I say? Yes? No? Not yet? Well, excuse me, sir, do you still make letter bombs? He says, no. I work at the Red Cross Children's Hospital, which is just around the corner from you. Will you forgive me? Yes, sir, I forgive you. And personally, I would prefer that you spend the rest of your life working in that hospital rather than be locked up in prison. Because I believe 1,000 times more in the justice of restoration than the justice of punishment. So often we say justice, we mean punishment, if not revenge. But it's another kind of justice, the justice of restoring relationships. So then I sit with my new friend and we drink the Ceylon tea I've been given while I've been here, the very best, and say, well, my friend, I've forgiven you, but I still have no hands. I've forgiven you, but I still only have one eye. My eardrums are still damaged. I'll always need someone to assist me for the rest of my life. Of course you'll help pay for that person. Not as a condition of forgiveness, but as part of reparation and restitution and the ways that are possible. But Chevaan, I want to say something else. Often when people are hurting, kind people are often too quick to tell them that they should forgive, and they increase their burdens. Because when we're hurting, often we need a hug rather than a sermon about forgiveness. We need people to hear our pain, and then perhaps one day we might choose to travel the journey of forgiveness. But so forgiveness is sometimes there, but always, 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 we have to deal with what we have inside them. And often the first step towards healing begins when I say, I'm full of hatred, I'm bitter, I want revenge, but it's messing me up, it's destroying me. And so I need to get rid of it step by step for the sake of myself, so that I can live a life, so that I don't have to be a prisoner of the terrible things that have happened to me. But we're saying these words in a short interview of an hour, but for some people this can be the journey of decades, getting to the point where they can begin to see what it is they have in them, and to travel a journey, if you like, of detoxifying, vomiting out the poison. But also we have to, at the same time, accept to have those feelings is normal, it's part of our humanness. But there are feelings which, if you like, we need to let go of, and there are feelings we need to carry with us. Feelings which are destructive, feelings which are life-giving.
For more than 4 years at the hearings organized at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, thousands of those guilty revealed the crimes they have committed in the name of apartheid and obtained the forgiveness of the nation. And many victims came to forgive by exchanging truth for reconciliation. And South Africa, little by little, freed itself from apartheid and avoided a bloodbath.
You met a fascinating man recently, Pope Francis. What did he say to you?
Well, it began with humor. He'd invited me in January, 2 days' notice. Come from Cape Town, come to the Vatican, come and meet me. And I was due to go to Myanmar. So I said, Your Holiness, sorry, I can't make it.
You said no to the Pope.
I said no to the Pope. So I thought that would be the end of that. So then in June, he invites me with a week's notice. So I could come. So I began by saying, Your Holiness, I've come to ask for forgiveness. You invited me, and I said, no, I'm sorry. And I said, I thought I'd never hear from you again. He laughs and he says, there was, if I had not invited you, there would be a voice speaking to me, saying, I need to invite you. So we had 3/4 of an hour like this, a one-on-one, extraordinary meeting. I mean, he'd long been one of my heroes. I think he's a hero for humanity. And I think it's because, and we talk, a lot of the conversation was about the power of acknowledgement and the way that he has been able to acknowledge the pain of the human family in so many places and come with a voice. He gave me his book called On Mercy. And so his message is about mercy and compassion and generosity and kindness. Towards the end of the interview, I said, Your Holiness, there are some people in the world who don't like you, but that is the same reason that most people in the world love you. And then he ended the interview with wonderful embrace and said, please pray for me. Now when one of the great figures of our time asks you to pray for him, but he also told me about a prayer he says for himself every day. It's the prayer of St. Thomas More for having a good sense of humor. So as I say, there was laughter and joy in the meeting, even as we spoke about deep and serious things. And one of the things I was saying to him, there are many people who hope that perhaps the next encyclical, the next message from the Pope will be about the profound commitment to peace. And one of the wonderful things that I said thank you to him for was that he had put into the Catholic catechism that the Catholics do not accept the death penalty, ever. So in a sense, he's a figure speaking of a God of life, of gentleness, of kindness, of compassion. So it was one of the privileges of my lifetime to have that opportunity to be with Pope Francis, talking in the same way I'm talking to Chevaan today.
Not quite the same privilege, but...
In 1998, in Cape Town, after his own experience and conscience that millions of other people had suffered terribly, Father Michael Lapsley established the Institute for Healing of Memories. He provided space for the victims as well as perpetrators of violence so that they could tell their stories in expression workshops in order to overcome their trauma. Today, Father Michael travels the world to promote this work of healing. His journey of healing at present have managed to reach the hearts of many, including those in Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka struggled through 30 years of civil war, and our sense of national unity was stretched to a brim on the 21st of April. And yet our community held strong. So there's something there that as a nation we can be proud of. Perhaps you can't say the same about our politics, which is incredibly divisive. But as we move into a future as a united nation, what's your message to Sri Lankans, particularly young Sri Lankans?
I think, you know, coming after the horror of the Easter bombing of the Catholic churches, of the Zion Christian Church and of the hotels, fundamentally I wanted to come with a loving embrace to the people of Sri Lanka, and to acknowledge the pain, the wrong that was done, but also a voice of caution. Everywhere in the world, wherever people are excluded or feel marginalized, eventually they go to war. So a world, a Sri Lanka at peace with itself, has to be a place where everybody feels there's a place in the sun. I often say when I come to a country, what kind of nation do you want your children and grandchildren to grow up in? Do you want your children and grandchildren to play together or to kill each other? From a faith perspective, I ask the question, what is God's dream for the people of Sri Lanka? And what's our part in participating in that? So we have to look to the root causes, but we also have to heal the wounds. The issue of the disappearances has to be addressed fully. We have to wrestle with the past. And we as all the communities have to deal with their hopes and fears, because it's both the minorities and the majorities have their hopes and fears. And in a way, we need a new national conversation, a conversation which is not just a conversation of politics, and which all the communities can speak about their pain. Because if we could do that in a reverent and respectful way, it's actually our very pain that can begin to unite us. But it has to be on the basis of our common humanity. The last thing is that there's a lot of evidence that when wars end, when the shooting stops, it doesn't stop in the bedroom. So you have an escalation of domestic, family, sexual violence because people are carrying this stuff in them. So we need to see the relationship between what happens in public space and what happens in private space and begin to have a national conversation about that as well. You know, our vocation in a way is a very simple term, is all of us to become wounded healers.
A conversation that the people of Sri Lanka will no doubt see the value in having, but whether our politicians might understand and comprehend how important it is an entirely different story. Father Lapsley, unfortunately, this fascinating conversation must come to an end. Time is limited. But I'd like to end with a thought that was shared by somebody we both admire, Mr. Nelson Mandela, when he said that nobody is born with hate. Nobody is born hating another for his or her religion or race or color. Hate is taught and learnt. And if hate is taught and learnt, so is love. And love is much more natural to the human heart than hate can ever be. Thank you for honoring us with your presence.
Amen. I agree. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us, Father Lapsley. Thank you. And